1944, the Normandy beaches have been seized. Tens of thousands of Allied troops pour onto French soil, supported by an unending tide of equipment, tanks, trucks, artillery, aircraft, all streaming from the beaches into the shattered landscape. Ahead of them lies the promise of liberating Europe, of driving the Nazi war machine back to Berlin. But in the hushed, tense war rooms of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, a different kind of war was being waged. A silent, desperate battle against an enemy far more insidious than the Panzer divisions. It was a war against distance, against physics, against the sheer, crushing weight of logistics. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, understood this truth intimately. He knew that an army, no matter how powerful, was utterly useless without its lifeblood: fuel. Every Sherman tank, every Jeep, every Spitfire, every transport truck demanded an unceasing, almost unimaginable quantity of gasoline and diesel. Without it, the spearhead of liberation would stall, vulnerable and defeated not by German bullets, but by an empty fuel tank. In the blistering summer of 1944, as Allied armies surged eastward across France after the breakout from Normandy, this crisis became terrifyingly real. Supply lines stretched, twisting back over hundreds of miles of ravaged roads, vulnerable to enemy ambush, choked by the sheer volume of traffic. The ports, vital for unloading supplies, were either still in German hands or had been systematically destroyed, their docks choked with rubble, their channels sown with mines. Each day, the advancing armies consumed hundreds of thousands of gallons of petroleum, oil, and lubricants, what the military called POO. And each day, the logistical system struggled, then faltered, then began to buckle under the strain. Commanders like General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was famed for its lightning advances, found his tanks literally running on fumes. Stories emerged of Sherman tanks being abandoned by the roadside, their crews desperately scouring villages for a few precious gallons of civilian petrol. Aircraft indispensable for ground support were grounded. The momentum, so painstakingly built, threatened to dissipate. The strategic dilemma was stark. Push hard and risk running out of fuel, or pause and allow the German forces to regroup, reinforcing their defensive lines. The entire invasion, the very liberation of a continent, hung by a thread, threatened by an invisible enemy that no amount of courage or firepower could defeat. The question wasn't if they could fight, but if they could even get to the fight. What if there was another way? A way to bypass the clogged roads, the bombed ports, the vulnerable truck convoys. A way to deliver the lifeblood of modern war, silently and unseen, directly from the industrial heart of Britain to the battlefields of France. This was the audacious, almost fantastical challenge faced by a small group of British engineers and scientists years before D-Day. Their solution would become one of the most remarkable and least celebrated logistical feats of the Second World War. A colossal undersea pipeline, an engineering marvel known by its deceptive codename, Pluto. The pipeline under the ocean. In the early days of World War II, the importance of oil and its secure delivery was understood on all sides. Germany's strategic planners were keenly aware of their nation's dependence on external sources for petroleum. Their audacious blitzkrieg, the lightning war that swept across Poland, France, and into the Soviet Union, relied on petroleum in unprecedented quantities. But even for the German war machine, the logistical challenges of fuel delivery eventually became a choke point. As their armies plunged deeper into Russia, their supply lines stretched to breaking point, a problem exacerbated by Allied bombing of their synthetic oil plants. For Britain, an island nation, the sea lanes were the umbilical cord of survival. Tankers, laden with precious crude and refined oil, navigated the treacherous Atlantic, constantly hunted by German U-boats. The sheer volume of fuel required to sustain a modern fighting force was staggering. Planners in London knew that any future invasion of mainland Europe would face an unprecedented logistical hurdle. How could an army of millions, equipped with tens of thousands of vehicles and aircraft, be supplied with hundreds of thousands of tons of fuel every single day across the English Channel, then hundreds of miles inland? The conventional answer was obvious: tankers. Ships would transport fuel from British ports to captured French ports, where it would then be offloaded and distributed by rail and truck. This was the system that had sustained armies for centuries. But the scale of the planned D-Day invasion, Operation Overlord, was unlike anything seen before. The planners projected that within weeks of the invasion, Allied forces would require approximately 3,000 tons of fuel per day. Within months, this figure would skyrocket to 10,000 tons daily, or roughly 2 million gallons. And every single gallon of that fuel would have to cross the English Channel. The problem with tankers was multifold. Firstly, they were prime targets for U-boats and enemy aircraft. Losing a single tanker meant the loss of thousands of tons of irreplaceable fuel. Secondly, the capture and repair of ports would be slow and difficult. German demolition teams were expected to destroy port facilities thoroughly, as indeed they did at Cherbourg and other vital harbors. Thirdly, even if ports were operational, the sheer number of tankers and the bottleneck of unloading would create immense delays. And finally, the onward distribution from port to battlefront would require a vast fleet of fuel trucks, consuming a significant portion of the very fuel they were meant to deliver. This was the strategic dilemma. The traditional means of supply were insufficient, vulnerable, and created new logistical demands. It was against this backdrop of immense strategic challenge that an audacious, almost improbable idea began to take shape. The seed of it was planted in April 1942, not by a military general, but by an oil expert from the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, Mr. Geoffrey William Lloyd. He was a civil servant in the petroleum department, a quiet, unassuming man whose desk was piled high with reports on Britain's fuel supplies. Lloyd looked at the maps, he looked at the distances, and he looked at the sheer, impossible tonnage. And he asked a question that would change the course of the war. Why couldn't the fuel be pumped directly across the channel? The concept was not entirely new. Small-scale pipelines had been laid across rivers or lakes for temporary military purposes. But to span the treacherous, submarine-infested English Channel, with its strong currents and shipping traffic, was an entirely different proposition. The idea was initially met with skepticism, even outright dismissal. The technical challenges seemed insurmountable. How do you lay a pipeline hundreds of feet beneath the sea, across 30 or 40 miles, in secret and ensure it could withstand immense pressure and remain intact under wartime conditions? Undaunted, Lloyd pressed his case. He found an early champion in Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, then Chief of Combined Operations, a man known for his willingness to embrace unconventional thinking and risky ventures. Mountbatten saw the strategic brilliance of the idea. A continuous, unseen flow of fuel, impervious to U-boats and air attacks once submerged. He nicknamed the project Pluto. Pipeline under the ocean. A simple, almost innocent designation to mask its true significance. With Mountbatten's backing, the project was handed to a team of brilliant engineers. At the forefront was Arthur Hartley, the chief engineer of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a man whose expertise lay in the very domain of oil transport. Hartley, along with his colleagues, faced a formidable engineering puzzle. Conventional rigid steel pipe, used for land-based pipelines, was impossible to lay across the channel without specialized, large-scale pipe-laying ships that would have been obvious targets and easily detected by German intelligence. They needed something flexible, something that could be spooled like a giant cable. This led to two parallel innovations. The first was AIS pipe, named after its inventor H.A. Ellis. This was essentially a submarine telephone cable with the core removed, allowing it to carry fuel instead of electrical signals. It consisted of a lead alloy core, strengthened with steel tape and insulated with jute. It was flexible but relatively small in diameter, limiting its flow rate. The second, more ambitious design was Hamel pipe, developed by B.J. Hammack and J.N. Dean. This was a completely novel design, flexible steel piping that could be welded into long sections, then wound onto massive floating drums. The idea was that these drums, essentially giant bobbins, could be towed across the channel, unspooling the pipeline as they went. The Hayes pipe was developed by Siemens Brothers and Standard Telephones and Cables, companies with extensive experience in submarine telegraph cables. The Hemel pipe, on the other hand, was an entirely new manufacturing challenge, requiring specialized steel and precise welding techniques. Tests were conducted, often in secret, far from prying eyes, at locations like Tilbury Docks and the Firth of Clyde. The engineers grappled with unprecedented challenges: how to lay the pipe without kinks, how to join sections at sea, how to ensure it withstood the enormous pressures of continuous pumping. Early tests involved laying pipes in coastal waters, and the failures were numerous. Pipes burst, connections leaked, and laying techniques proved clumsy. But each failure was a lesson, leading to refinements in materials, design, and methodology. The vision was audacious. Imagine a pipe, just a few inches in diameter, but stretching for dozens of miles beneath the cold, dark waters of the English Channel. It would need to withstand the crushing pressure of the sea, the constant movement of currents, and the occasional scraping of anchors. And it would need to deliver hundreds of gallons of fuel per minute, 24 hours a day, without interruption. It was a technological gamble of immense proportions. The stakes were nothing less than the success or failure of the greatest amphibious invasion in history. If Pluto worked, it would revolutionize military logistics. If it failed, the consequences for the Allied advance could be catastrophic. As D-Day approached, the pressure mounted. Training began in earnest. The ships tasked with laying Pluto were ordinary merchant vessels, hastily converted with massive spooling equipment. They were given innocuous names like HMS SS Persephone and SS Latimer to avoid suspicion. Crews were trained in the delicate art of laying pipe, a skill that combines seafaring knowledge with engineering precision. The entire project was shrouded in absolute secrecy. The German intelligence services, obsessed with troop movements, fortifications, and naval activity, had no inkling of the silent revolution brewing beneath the waves. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The Allied armies landed on the beaches of Normandy. The initial days were brutal, marked by fierce German resistance and the slow, bloody crawl inland. But once the beachheads were secured, the true logistical nightmare began. Even before the breakout from the Normandy hedgerows, the demand for fuel was insatiable. Vehicles that landed with a full tank quickly needed replenishment. Landing craft operating round the clock consumed their own vast quantities. The initial plan, designated Operation Neptune, called for a temporary harbor, the famous Mulberry Bee, to be established off Romanches. This artificial port, an engineering marvel in itself, would serve as the primary conduit for supplies. But even Mulberry Bee had limitations. Tankers could offload directly into it, but then the fuel still had to be transferred ashore, pumped into storage tanks, and then trucked to the front. The system was a stopgap designed to get the armies ashore and sustain them for the first few weeks. It was never intended to support a rapid, deep penetration into enemy territory. The capture of the port of Cherbourg in late June was a critical objective. It was a deep-water port, capable of handling larger vessels and offloading greater quantities of supplies. But as anticipated, the Germans had thoroughly demolished it, sowing mines, destroying docks, and sabotaging cranes. It took weeks of painstaking work by Allied engineers and salvage teams to make Cherbourg even partially operational. And even then, the capacity remained far below what was needed to sustain the accelerating Allied advance. By July, after weeks of grinding combat in the Norman blockade, Allied forces achieved their breakout with Operation Cobra. General Patton's Third Army, unleashed from its positions, surged south and east, covering vast distances in a matter of days. This was the rapid, mobile warfare the Allies had trained for, but it instantly exposed the Achilles heel of their supply chain: Patton's tanks and trucks were outrunning their fuel. His famous quote, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have gotta have gas," perfectly encapsulated the crisis. The advance was literally slowing to a crawl. Not because of German resistance, but because the fuel wasn't arriving fast enough. It wasn't just gasoline. The entire logistical network was under immense strain. Every bullet, every K ration, every spare part, every medical supply had to be transported from the beaches or the slowly recovering ports. Trucks organized into vast, round-the-clock convoys known as the Red Ball Express worked themselves to exhaustion. Drivers slept for mere hours, eating on the go, pushing their vehicles to the breaking point. But even with thousands of trucks and thousands of men, the roads were finite, the distances immense, and the throughput simply insufficient for the voracious appetite of a modern mechanized army. A single supply dump in France could require hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel per day, and there were dozens of these dumps. Back in Britain, the engineers of Pluto knew their moment was coming. The initial plan had been to lay the pipelines once deep water ports like Cherbourg were fully operational, connecting them directly to the British mainland. But the rapid advance and the worsening fuel crisis meant a more immediate, less ambitious connection was needed. The first Pluto lines were laid across the narrowest part of the channel, from Dungeness on the English coast to the liberated port of Boulogne in France. This was Operation Sanson, using the flexible hay-ice pipe. On August 12, 1944, just 2 months after D-Day, the first high-ice pipeline was successfully laid. It stretched 30 miles from the beaches of the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg, using the ships HMS Latimer and HMS SS Persephone. This was a longer, more challenging route. The operation was slow, painstaking, and fraught with peril. The unwieldy pipe-laying ships, often moving at just a few knots, were vulnerable. Divers worked in shifts, battling currents and cold, making connections and checking integrity. The threat of German U-boats, though diminished, was still real. But against all odds, the pipe was laid. Then came the moment of truth. The pumping began. Huge pumping stations, disguised as seaside bungalows or even ice cream parlors in Kent to maintain secrecy, began to push fuel through the submerged lines. The pressure was immense. The engineers held their breath. Would the pipe hold? Would the connections fail? A trickle, then a steady flow, then a torrent of fuel began to emerge on the French side, flowing into newly constructed depots. It was a silent, unheralded miracle. Over the next few weeks, more lines followed. By early September, a cluster of 17 Hayes lines, and later 3 Hamel lines, were laid across the shorter northern route from Dungeness to Boulogne, a distance of about 25 miles. This network alone could eventually pump over 1,000 tons of fuel a day. At its peak, the Pluto system consisted of 21 pipelines, 17 of them Hayes and 4 Hamel, spanning the channel. Imagine the sheer scale. Hundreds of miles of pipe, each joint meticulously welded, each section laid with precision, now silently delivering the lifeblood of an entire army. The impact was immediate and profound. Suddenly, fuel was arriving directly onto French soil, bypassing the heavily congested ports and the overstretched road network. Each Pluto line had the capacity to deliver significant quantities of fuel, and collectively, they represented a pipeline of immense strategic importance. By the end of September 1944, Pluto was delivering over 3,000 tons of fuel per day. By the end of the war, the system had pumped over 172 million gallons of petrol to the advancing Allied armies. This was a continuous, invisible river of fuel, flowing without the need for a single tanker, a single truck, or a single dock worker once established. Consider the strategic consequences. The Red Ball Express, while heroic and vital, required thousands of trucks and drivers. Each truck consumed its own fuel for the round trip. A single convoy could stretch for miles, an obvious target for German aircraft or ambushes. Pluto eliminated all of these vulnerabilities for a significant portion of Allied fuel needs. It freed up road networks for ammunition, food, and other critical supplies. It reduced the burden on already strained port facilities. It allowed Allied commanders to plan offensive operations with greater confidence, knowing that the fuel at least would be there. For the advancing Allied armies, this reliable flow of fuel was a game changer. It fueled the dash across France after the Falaise Pocket encirclement, allowing Patton's tanks to continue their relentless pursuit of the retreating German army. It provided the impetus for the lightning thrusts towards the Rhine. While the supply chain remained a challenge throughout the campaign, Pluto mitigated the most critical aspect, the lack of available POL. It allowed for greater operational flexibility and reduced the time spent waiting for replenishment, maintaining the offensive momentum. What of the German perspective? Hitler's high command was increasingly plagued by its own profound fuel crisis. Germany had limited natural oil reserves and relied heavily on synthetic fuel production derived from coal. But these synthetic oil plants, concentrated in places like Lona and Politz, became prime targets for Allied strategic bombing campaigns from early 1944 onwards. By late 1944, German fuel production had plummeted. Tank divisions were frequently immobile for lack of fuel. The Luftwaffe, once a terror, was grounded for days. Its experienced pilots unable to fly, the strategic bombing campaign against German oil facilities was literally throttling the German war machine. The irony is striking. As German forces faced crippling fuel shortages and their tanks and aircraft stood idle, their adversaries were literally pumping an unseen river of oil beneath the waves, fueling an unstoppable advance. German intelligence, though sophisticated in many areas, completely missed the significance of Pluto. They detected the unusual ship movements, the strange activities on the Kent coast, and the construction of unusual buildings. But they dismissed them as part of the overall D-Day deception plan, or as attempts to lay submarine communication cables. The idea of an undersea pipeline for fuel was simply too outlandish, too far-fetched for their conventional understanding of logistics. They were looking for battleships, for troop concentrations, for visible vulnerabilities. They never imagined the silent, subterranean weapon that was enabling the Allied advance. This strategic blindness was compounded by German overconfidence in the effectiveness of their demolition of French ports. They believed that by utterly destroying Cherbourg and other harbors, they had crippled the Allied logistical capacity for months. And while the destruction certainly caused immense headaches, Pluto offered a bypass, a workaround that allowed the Allies to circumvent the very obstacles Germany had painstakingly erected. The pipeline was an invisible hand, slowly but inexorably strangling the German war effort by enabling the Allied one. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 perfectly illustrated Pluto's importance. When Hitler launched his desperate counteroffensive through the Ardennes, German tanks, particularly the formidable Panzer V Panthers and Tiger Eyes, made initial gains, exploiting the element of surprise in the severe winter weather. But even during this critical period, the Pluto lines continued to pump, while Allied ground forces struggled with the weather and the ferocious German assault. The unseen flow of fuel continued to replenish forward depots, ensuring that when the weather finally cleared and the counterattacks began, Allied tanks and aircraft had the necessary fuel to fight. Had Pluto not been in operation, the already strained logistical system during the Bulge would likely have collapsed, potentially prolonging the battle and increasing Allied casualties significantly. By the spring of 1945, as Allied armies crossed the Rhine and pushed into the heart of Germany, Pluto was providing the crucial margin of fuel needed to maintain the relentless pace. From the initial trickle to a flood, it delivered hundreds of thousands of gallons of gasoline and diesel daily, ensuring that the final decisive thrust towards Berlin would not be stalled by a lack of fuel. The pipeline effectively short-circuited a fundamental logistical weakness, transforming it into a strength. Pluto was never a silver bullet. It was one part of a vast, complex, logistical effort that included the Red Bull Express, rehabilitated rail lines, and functioning ports, but it was a critical, often unacknowledged, component. It freed up other resources, reduced vulnerabilities, and provided a steady, reliable flow of the most vital commodity in modern warfare. Its existence allowed Allied commanders to make aggressive strategic decisions, confident that their armies would not simply run out of gas. After the war, the Pluto pipelines were gradually dismantled. Most of the Haz pipe, with its lead sheathing, was salvaged for its valuable metal content. Some sections remain at the bottom of the channel, a silent testament to human ingenuity. The technology, however, lived on. The innovations in flexible piping, pumping techniques, and undersea laying methods developed for Pluto found applications in post-war oil and gas exploration, particularly in the North Sea. It demonstrated that complex, long-distance undersea pipelines were not only feasible but could be economically viable. The story of Pluto is a powerful reminder that wars are not won by combat alone. They are won by logistics, by industry, by the unsung efforts of engineers and workers, and by strategic decisions made far from the battlefield. The pipeline that helped defeat Germany was not a tank, a plane, or a gun. It was an invisible artery, a triumph of engineering and quiet perseverance that delivered the lifeblood of an army. Silently, relentlessly, and decisively. It was a transformation in military logistics. It highlighted the contradiction that a static, fixed piece of infrastructure could enable the most dynamic, rapid forms of warfare. It overturned the misconception that only visible, direct military action won wars. It solved a critical strategic dilemma, enabled a daring technological gamble, and resulted in an unexpected outcome, an unseen pipeline becoming a silent yet powerful weapon in the arsenal of liberation. The ultimate historical irony is that one of the most critical factors in defeating the highly mechanized German war machine was not a superweapon, but a subterranean conduit, a continuous, unwavering flow of fuel that the Germans never saw coming and could never stop. It was the hidden engine behind the Allied advance, allowing the forces of freedom to drive relentlessly towards victory, gallon by precious gallon.